Welcome, everyone. We will start in a minute. Just let the time for a participant to join the meeting. Okay, I think we'll start. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on which provinces you're based, and welcome to our LMA GC panel. I am Valérie Laplante, Business Development Director at BLG, and a member of our LME Canada board, and I'll be your host today. We are pleased to host this event virtually again this year and see legal marketers from across the country viewing this event. I'm personally very pleased to see several members among the participants, but also a lot of non-members or maybe future members. So welcome everyone. I hope you will find this event very interesting as we will talk about risk management, a topic that has taken a lot of place in our General Counsel strategic agenda these days. Before we start, I would like to invite all the participants to ask their question in the Q&A tool. And if time allows at the end of the session, we will do our best to answer your question. Now, I would like to take a moment to thank our four panelists, Bindu, Nizam, Thomas, and Roland, as well as our sponsor, K-Media. I also would like to say a special thanks for Lucy Saddleton and Tim Wilbert from K-Media, without whom this event would not have been feasible. Speaking of K-Media, to moderate the conversation today, we have the pleasure to welcome Tim Wilbert, current Global Managing Editor of K-Media print and digital law publication, including Lexpert, Canadian lawyers, in-house, Law Times, and Australian lawyer. A licensed lawyer, Tim is a graduate of McMaster University with a degree in philosophy and human rights and Juris Doctor law degree from the University of Toronto. He has over 16 years of publishing experience, starting as the focus editor on the Lawyer's Weekly publication at LexisNexis and managing legal editorial content for Thomson Reuters. His reporting covers all areas of law in Canada, and he also oversees content for K-Media's legal event, including the Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand Law Awards and Lexpert Rising Stars. He has appeared on panel discussions and as chair and emceed leading event for the legal community in Canada. So without further delay, I'll leave it to Tim to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Valerie, and welcome everyone to the session. I'm really excited to speak today on risk management 2.0. Today we'll be looking at the new trends in risk management, how businesses are adapting to change, and how general counsel are changing their approach to risk management and things such as the force majeure. So I'm pleased to present our four panelists today. First off, I'll introduce Nizam Hasham. Nizam is the General Counsel and Assistant Corporate Secretary at Canadian Pacific, reporting to the Chief Legal Officer. Nizam's responsibilities include advising on corporate governance matters, liaising with the board of CP, supporting financial disclosures, and managing CP's proxy management proxy circular, as well as its annual meeting of shareholders. Next up, I'd like to introduce Bindu Cudjoe. Bindu is the Chief Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary for Laurentian Bank of Canada, serving as a member of its executive team. She leads the legal, corporate secretariat, and regulatory risk management functions at the bank. And next up, I'd like to introduce Thomas Sandrum. Thomas is the Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary at Cineplex Incorporated. Thomas joined Cineplex in 2008 and oversees all legal, corporate governance, and securities matters for Cineplex and its Canadian and US subsidiaries. And last but not least, we have Roland Hung. Roland is a counsel at Torkin Main's Business Law and Technology, Privacy and Data Management Groups. He was the former Chief Legal Officer and Chief Privacy Officer at Viva Metrica Limited, and the Senior Legal Counsel and Global Privacy Officer of Finning International Incorporated as well. So welcome, everyone. So first off, I'd like you all to have a chance to tell us about your company, your role or firm, and your role and the size of your legal team. So I'll start off with Bindu.
Great, thanks, Tim, and it's terrific to be here. Very happy to join this great panel. Laurentian Bank of Canada is 176 years old. We are headquartered in Montreal, and we are a full-service bank, the 7th largest Schedule I bank in Canada. We have about 3,000 employees. They're split almost between Quebec and Ontario, so quite a few now in Ontario. And my role, as you heard, is as the Chief Legal Officer. So I cover all of legal, regulatory compliance, as well as the corporate secretariat. And I have about just under 20 on the legal side and about 40 on the regulatory compliance side, where we handle all matters of regulatory compliance, privacy, anti-money laundering, accessibility. Anyways, we can start talking about regulation in the financial services sector, but it's quite a broad remit, and constantly surprised at what falls into that bucket. So, but it's a great role, and I'm really happy to have it.
Great, thank you, Bindu. Thomas, would you like to tell us about your company, your role, and the size of your legal team?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm at Cineplex. I think everyone is familiar with our cinemas. We're the largest cinema operator in Canada, but we do a lot more than that. We are also we operate entertainment facilities. We're in the advertising business, and we operate in the gaming and arcade business in Canada and the United States. So it's kind of cross-border, many different disciplined business. I'm delighted to be part of a small but mighty legal team. We're 10 people, and I'll do a shameless plug for my colleagues. This year we won Best Law Department at the Canadian Law Awards, and my colleagues get all the credit for that. I work with fantastic people.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. And it's not shameless when you're plugging us and not yourself. So it's great. Your team won. We gave you the award. So we're all good. Next up is Nisam. Nisam, can you tell us about your legal department, your role, and the size of your legal team?
Sure. So as you mentioned, Tim, so I'm General Counsel, Assistant Corporate Secretary to Canadian Pacific. I myself have a team of 5 in total, including me on the corporate secretarial side, and we're part of the bigger legal team, which includes public affairs and government affairs as well. And that group is about 50 under my Chief Legal Officer, Jeff Ellis. So I've been with CP for coming on to 10 years in 2023. We, as you mentioned, we get involved in numerous areas in the corporate secretarial function, everything from compliance matters to the annual meeting, and sort of a broad breadth of issues in between that.
Great, thank you. And Roland, if you can tell us a bit about, I know you're up in private practice now, so you could tell us about Torkin Main's, your practice group there and the firm, as well as the size of the legal team that you managed when you were in an in-house position.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so currently I'm at Torquay Mains. I'm in the technology, privacy and data management group. Our team consists of three lawyers, but we actually have other lawyers that practice adjacent to us as well. So I would say our team is give or take around 15 if you include people in litigation and people in corporate commercial that also does some privacy and sometimes technology work with us as well. So please think of us when you need any privacy or technology assistance. But the real reason why I think I was invited to talk on this panel was because of my prior experience, in-house experience. So I was the chief legal officer and chief privacy officer of Viva Metrica. So Viva Metrica, for those that do not know, is a company that does a lot of health, use a lot of personal health data for analytics. They developed platforms and apps using personal health data. They were eventually sold to Sprout, which is another tech company in Toronto, and Sprout was recently sold to TELUS Health. When I was there, I was a team of one and I report directly to the CEO and the CFO. At Finning International, where I was the senior legal counsel and the global privacy officer, our team was around 20 people around the world. In the privacy office that I headed up, I had direct reports, at least 2 direct reports in each of the regions that Finning operated out of, so that we could work together and make sure we're in compliance with the regulations in each of the other jurisdictions outside of Canada that we're operating in as well.
Great, thank you. So one of the great things about this panel is we have quite a wide range of industries, I think, represented, which is great. So the answers I would imagine are going to be quite different from each of you about what risk management and risk is. So that's my last question is, if you could tell me a bit about how your legal team's involved with risk management. Some of you kind of touched on that already, and sort of what risks are currently top of mind in your role and at your company. So maybe I'll start with Nizam.
Sorry, I just had to unmute myself. It's the curse of these virtual meetings. Thanks for the questions, Tim. They're great questions. So we have a standalone risk function at Canadian Pacific. So legal and corporate secretarial work very closely with the standalone risk function. So our risk function or risk group is headed up by a senior vice president of risk. And the model, as he tells me, is a little bit different. So you'll have matters such as insurance, hazmat, environmental matters, all centralized under the risk function. And then you'll have the legal department or, in certain cases, the corporate secretarial department supporting that standalone risk group, and that's how we've structured it. From what I'm told, it's a bit of a different model than other organizations, but that's how we do it at CP.
Great, and Bindu, you could tell us a bit about how it's structured. Your legal team is structured and how it's involved with risk management and what risks are currently top of mind in your sphere.
Yeah, so in the banking sector, we're going to think about the 3 lines of defense. And so legal, along with all of the other risks, sort of often are created and or managed at the first level. And then there's an oversight activity that happens in the second line. And so legal, regulatory compliance, as well as all the different other categories of risks that exist in banks. And I think banks have probably been pretty awesome at creating the most categories of risks and calling them out very distinctly and managing them that way. So, in our operational risk management framework, there are 17, 18 kinds of risks, and legal risk is one kind, regulatory compliance risk is another. And so, I guess in a risk management world, I have direct accountability for a number of those risks. And of course, sort of broader, more meta risks like, reputational risks that are fed in other ways. I would say from the risk management perspective, our team, both legal, corporate secretariat, and regulatory compliance, we're looking after the bank from a couple of different lenses. It's managing risk in the contractual relationships and the service relationships that we have with customers. So sometimes we're weighing in and, dealing with disputes or drafting involved in contracts, because everything in banking is in fact a contract, right? So we're managing risks through the language in contracts. And then we're also, of course, acting for and managing risks for the organization, sort of like Nizam as a public company. So, what are we doing to meet our public company disclosure obligations, managing the relationships with our shareholders. And then we also manage the risks that have us acting as a company vis-a-vis other third parties like procurement and suppliers and whatnot. So it's a very multi-dimensional role. We work very closely with our risk colleagues across the organization. We're all trying to manage risks in our swim lanes, but also obviously there's a sharing of there's impact, multi-risk impacts that happen with any particular event or incident or moment or affair. So it's really interesting when you sort of think about your job as risk management, and that's what I think as a lawyer we do particularly well. Our expertise is in one area. And I think what's been neat about working in financial institutions for me is that the range of risks that I understand or that I, have increasingly had accountability for has broadened over the years, right? From me worrying about whether we were complying with a particular statute when I was, back in private practice to now sort of having a really wide array of rules, laws, and regulations to make sure that we're sticking and tying to.
Great. Thomas, can you tell us about how your legal team is involved with risk management and what are the current risks that you're top of mind at Cineplex?
Sure, Tim. So I guess I'll hit upon the four big ones that I'm really kind of that are top of mind for me right now. We work really closely with our risk management department. So for the longest time, insurance. So the four big ones here are right now for me are health and safety, insurance, securities law, and IT security. For the longest time, insurance oversight lived within the legal department, and we've just done a bit of a restructuring this year, and we've moved it to the risk management department. And there's just a lot of structural reasons why we thought that move made the most sense, but we're still very involved in that. Health and safety was always a priority. Right now, we've got approximately 13,000 employees, a lot of young people working in our buildings. We serve food, kitchens have hot stuff in them. So health and safety was always an issue, but that just ramped up incredibly because of COVID. We now have, our guests are in close proximity, and we cleaning protocols and distancing protocols. For example, one of the things we did, Tim, was when you buy a ticket, once you picked your seat, no one could buy a seat around you for 6 feet. So this was all stuff that was built into our ticketing system. Securities law is always present. No surprise. Cineplex is publicly traded, so our governance and our protocols to make sure we do everything properly is always important. And the last thing is IT security, and that became even more of an issue for us during COVID because of lockdown. We felt with everyone locked down that we were seeing a greater incidence of online attacks, people getting into our ticketing system and basically trying to get into our network. So it's not a surprise. Lots of people were at home and they were in front of screens all the time. But on top of that, obviously, it's the routine stuff. We get credit card data, we have employee data, we have customer data. So those are kind of the big ones, Tim. And, there's a whole subset when you get into all of these, looking after our buildings, looking after our policy reviews. But I think those are the big ones that I would hit on for now.
Great. Sounds like a lot. And I'm sure, as you say, you could keep going down in more level of detail for a very long time. So Roland, if you can just speak about specifically, I guess, when you were in-house, about how the legal team was involved with risk management, and then what risks were top of mind when you were in that role.
Yeah, definitely. So what I think I will do is I'm going to speak first about Finning International, which was a multinational, and then I'll speak a little bit about Viva Metrica because it's a smaller emerging company, and the risk management approaches were very different. So at Finning International, the legal team was not the risk management function did not reside with legal, although we were heavily involved. There was a separate department that was responsible for risk management, but legal and the privacy office was definitely one of the stakeholders. So we would have, they would have quarterly meetings with all the stakeholders to update the risk registrar, right? To go over, operational risk, financial risk, privacy risk, IT risk, right? All of these different risks that so for example, as the privacy officer, I would provide an update on all the risk as it relates to IT, IS, and privacy related matters, right? But the legal department, the privacy office would not be responsible for all of the risk in that risk registrar, right? Because we would have representatives from HR, the labor group, marketing, communications involved to provide updates to each of the different risks, right? So the risk registrar is basically like a SWOT analysis in many, many ways, but a more involved SWOT analysis. Definitely, before I left, some of the risk that we focused on as a legal team as a privacy office were intellectual property risk, right? Because we had Finning Digital. We also, where we were developing platforms and software for such as telematics and all and whatnot for heavy equipment, changing regulations, right? Around privacy, right? And data management. Geopolitical issues because they have operations in South America, right? The risk involved in operating in Argentina, right? Things like currency risk that you probably wouldn't ever think of when just operating in Canada. Things like import and exporting laws in South America are ever-changing. I would say ever-changing laws around import and exporting in South America, and supply chain risk, right? Things like that. So those were issues that were very much top of mind, including, some of the things that Bindu and Thomas and Nazim has already highlighted, like contractual risk, right? Reputational risk, litigation. So litigation is directly, litigation would be something that legal would definitely handle, and we would definitely provide a report on that to the risk management committee, and all the disclosure risk, because Finning was a publicly traded company, right? That Tom is also highlighting. So with Viva Metrica, because it was a smaller company that eventually grew, at least at the beginning of Viva Metrica, or at least when I took the role of chief legal, we did SWOT analysis, but a less sophisticated risk. It was, I wouldn't say less sophisticated, but it was basically a similar approach as Finning, but on a way smaller scale, right? We did a SWOT analysis. We had a small little risk registrar. We initially operated only in Canada, but then over time we expanded into the US and China and other places, especially when we expanded in China. There were, other risks that we needed to consider. And some of the risk that we had to consider, of course, is the use of personal health data, right? Which was a big, big one because of all the regulations around how you can use personal health data and all the changing laws around that. Definitely that's tied into reputational risk, because we were fully aware that if we did not get this right, or if there was a breach, that could be disastrous for a company that uses personal health data. Also, in the risk of the loss of intellectual property. So we managed how we went around managing intellectual property was very important to us as a tech company, right? And litigation. Right, we, as a mid-size or emerging company, we had to make sure we managed litigation and disputes properly to ensure that it doesn't take up all of our resources and time.
Great. Thank you, Roland. So and Bindu, you spoke about this a little bit, but I'm interested in the evolution of risk and how often your company revisits this. And I know one thing that I would imagine has evolved is how data is used and how it plays into the process. So maybe Nizam, if you could start sort of answer that, how that fits into your world.
Sure. So the evolution of risk and how data fits in, absolutely. So in terms of evolution of risk, I of course work in a railway, and one of the one of the risks that we face is from weather, climate, particularly as well. So in this kind of environment, climate is something you think about. In terms of our team and the support that we provide to our environment team, there is much more that they're involved in terms of climate related matters. So they'll make submissions to the CDP index every year, to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index every year. There's a lot of data that undergirds that. And so we're helping with those disclosures. As well, as a public company, we are I think one of very few that have now a say on climate vote every year. So we had 86, I think it was 86.88% approval for our approach to climate change last year in our annual meeting. So you see that emerging as an important area, and one that both legal and corporate secretarial departments assist with.
Great, thank you. And Thomas, you spoke a bit about the pandemic, how that shifted a lot of the risks, but how have they evolved over time more broadly, I guess, and has maybe the pandemic's affected how data fits because people are using so much more digital communication. So can you speak a bit about how risks evolved for you and how data fits into that?
Yeah, so we're an entertainment company, and there's many different ways that people can engage with Cineplex. We've got our mobile app for phones and iPads and tablets. We've got cineplex.com online. We have a lot of data, and we're a joint owner of the Scene loyalty card program. It's one of the largest loyalty card programs in Canada. You guys should all sign up. It's a great program. We've got a lot of data, and companies are data hungry. So we want to tell you about special screenings. We want to tell you about such special promotions. You can buy your tickets online. You can order your food online and then have it delivered to your seat. And we collect all that information, so we know you like horror movies. You like to buy buttered popcorn. You like to buy this, or you like to buy that. And the challenge with all that data, there's a few challenges with the data. I think one of the values that the legal department brings, we're a creative company, we're an entertainment company. So we've got a lot of creative people who want to do really neat things. And we kind of have to say to them, we'll get you there, but you can't do it that way. And when, for example, when people sign up at Cineplex Connect or at Scene, one of the things the legal department has been very, very active about is how much information do we actually need? Do we need a mailing address? Do we need a postal code? Like, what do we actually need? Because I see every one of those little data points as a risk. So unless we're mailing you a physical card, I told my guys, we shouldn't really ask for addresses. Do we need the addresses? Of course, the marketing guys want everything. And the yin and the yang, and the challenge I've had is, we'll give you what you need, but I'm also really anticipating, God forbid, someone breaks into our systems, someone hacks into our systems. I think the biggest challenge for me with data really has been that our customers will use the same login credentials on 35 different websites. And as much as we remind people that they should have unique login credentials, when you've got tens of millions of people that are not being careful of their own data, how do I protect their data while still making things flexible enough that we can conduct business? So it's a real challenge to manage the data, and that says nothing about credit card data, employee data, but it's how do you be efficient and lawful, but also practical. So I try to say, you know, our legal department hopefully is not the legal department where dreams go to die. We try to get you there. Our default answer should be yes, but it's sometimes yes with a little asterisk next to it. So we'll get you where you need to go. Let's just do it a slightly different way.
Great. I like that. It's the yes, but not the no department. Bindu, if you could talk, I know you haven't been at Laurentian for a long time, but you've been in financial services for quite a while. So if you could speak about how risks evolve and how data fits into it in your world.
Absolutely. So, you know, again, we're selling different kinds of risk at the bank. And so we're constantly having to revisit what those risk registers are, where are we on them? We're constantly touching our policies and refreshing them. Needless to say, data is a huge, huge conversation, a huge topic. You know, data is gold and data is also toxic waste, right? And so we are very, very privileged as as a bank, as an important institution in Canadian society, that people give us their most protected information, right? Their personal, their confidential information, and they expect us to hold it secure, and they expect us to use it for the purposes that they gave it to us for. That being said, we of course, that's part of our customer promise back to our customers, but there's a lot of data that we have, and it's, you know, in our case, some of it is almost 200 years old. And so, you know, there's a volume, there's a quantum. How do we keep it? How do we store it? We collect data, right, in order, part of regulatory requirements, but we also have regulators who want us to give them data about things. So if I think about our obligations to help stop money laundering and terrorist financing, and to implement sanctions, we have regulators who want us to look through our data, who want us to give us data of our customers and our own data. And so how do we fulfill that? So, you know, I'd say, I think when data was all in paper, it was one thing to manage, and we worried about, you know, boxes and flooding and all sorts of physical things. But now that it's available, and has been available for many, many years, you know, on-premises applications and in the cloud and otherwise, it's presenting a different challenge and a different opportunity, right? So we have to look at the broader architecture, the technology infrastructure and the architecture of that, how we're moving data in and out, how we're destroying it on a regular way. And so it's, you know, needless to say, it's a multidisciplinary approach. It's, you know, the tech guys sort of saying, well, here's how we want to do this. It is, you know, record retention. It is legal risk that we might take on. It's regulatory risk. Like it's fraught. And then of course, you know, we've got things like events that happen that relate to data. So cyber events, and listen, I hate to say it, and I'm knocking on wood all over the place, but we are all like, you can't keep banging at the door of certain institutions and for there not to be breaches. And we see it happening, right? It's happening across every industry. And so, you know, we really, for me, it just begs the question about when we're going to get there to think differently about our information. And I'll go all the way back to when Equifax had its cyber breach. 250 million Americans had, frankly, their most sensitive data breached. And so at some point, is it something that we protect, or do we just kind of freely assume that it's out there for the world and we use different parts? And I don't know how we protect that. And I think about that from the banking perspective, where institutions have all these obligations, of course, to protect the information of their customers, but we also have a drive from customers and you know, consumers saying, but I want you to share that information, but only with whom I say it. And then of course we're on the hook for who we share it with And so it's a really interesting, it is interesting because I think it gets to the heart of, you know, where is the value in that? Is it by, does the value evaporate when it's no longer private? How do we protect the value? How do we maybe monetize the value? And how does that interplay between institutions and consumers? Because, you know, as much as people might be yelling and screaming at banks about protecting our information, they're giving away all their information all the time through Fitbits and using the same passwords and turning on their geotagging and all their social media. And yet, you know, we're struggling as organizations and institutions to protect that. So that's a little bit of a diatribe, I apologize, but data is clearly really, really important. But I think, frankly, fundamentally, as lawyers, as professionals in the space, we owe it to ourselves and our organizations and consumers to really try to rethink how this can all fit together as a paradigm, because the old ways of protecting are not working. And I don't even know, we're doing the best that we can. And I think we do a pretty good job. But as we move forward and there's just more and more, and the proliferation of data continues, there's got to be some different way to manage that for our organizations and for our own lives, right?
Great. Yeah, and Roland is here to help because he's a private practice lawyer now, and so maybe you can speak, Roland, about data and how risk has evolved. But I would imagine you could speak more broadly because you see many clients dealing with these issues, both in your you saw it as in-house counsel, but also now in private practice. So can you speak to this, sort of where things are moving and maybe where some of the solutions are?
Yeah, well, you know, what I will say is data is definitely a huge risk factor for a lot of companies, right? As Bindu said, you know, data is gold. Company is hungry for it. I know, well, Viewometrica was very hungry for your personal health data. They used it to you know, analyze and come up with metrics that, you know, they sold to insurance companies, right? That's how they generated revenue. So you had to ensure that you were on the right side of the regulations and the laws. And the laws in this area is changing, right? We know that there's a new bill coming out. But, you know, if I pause for a second and you know, set personal information aside, I would suggest to you what was interesting during my time at Finning is that it's not just personal information that is sensitive. When we talk about data, I'm also talking about customer data, right? Proprietary information, because of course, you know, I'm sure Cineplex, I'm sure CPR and the banks would have partnerships with other organizations where they collect proprietary information or confidential data that is not necessarily personal information, right? That is governed by legislation. And what we found out, you know, during my tenure is that customers, some of the big customers that Finning had, were very sensitive about providing data to Finning, right? Because as I've alluded to earlier, we had a division called Finning Digital that developed apps and platforms that used this data to mine this data to assist our customers with managing their fleets and operations. But some of our customers were very hesitant in providing this information to allow for these platforms and applications to work, right? Because they would argue this is sensitive information. We don't really want you to have it. We don't know how you're safeguarding it. So what I had to do when I took over as the privacy officer, and this is not, you know, privacy per se, but it's data governance. One of my first mandates was to develop a data governance framework, right, at Finning. And this is where, Tim, I would say at Finning, we were very, very intentional about using this risk around using data and turn it into a risk opportunity, because what we wanted to signal when we developed the data governance framework was to signal to the customers that you can trust us with your data, that when you give us your data, when you use our platforms like Cubic, right, and other telematic devices that we sell you, you can trust us with your data, right? Whether it's personal information or otherwise, we will not be sharing it, and we're not just saying that we're not going to share it. Here's how we're doing it. We're taking it seriously, right? And that became a selling feature, because whenever we had conversations with some of these big mining companies, whether it's in Chile, whether it's in Canada, sometimes the sales team would bring me along and our CISO, because I work very closely with our CISO, to explain to these companies how we will be protecting their data, right? And how we are very transparent about it, because we want to be partnered with them. So I do think that while data could be a risk, it could be an opportunity if done right, because you can demonstrate that you perhaps have a competitive advantage by putting all these safeguards and governance frameworks in place, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, touching on Thomas's earlier point, we've been very busy as a data management group. So I'm shifting gears and talking about my in-house, my private practice now. Been very busy because of the pandemic, right? Because a lot of people have been suffering breaches. A lot of companies have received ransomware attacks, right? And that's kind of on the rise because people are working remotely. I'm sure you've read a lot about this online. And what I would recommend in as a mitigation to that risk, and we definitely employed this at Finning and Viva Metrica, is to do training and tabletop exercises to the extent that you do. You can afford it, right? We put proper policies and procedures into place to ensure that you're prepared if there was an attack or a breach. But in addition to that, make sure you are training your teams and the various stakeholders on how to respond, right? To these risks. That's very important too. So
great. So one of the terms that became very, I think probably many lawyers knew it already, but became very widely known as force majeure during the pandemic. If you can speak a bit about how that concept may have come up in your context, or how you prepare for that for future force majeure, and how that idea sort of exists in your world. So maybe Thomas, if you can speak to that first.
Happy to do that. So for us, force majeure really it really hit in two ways. The first is we have a North American footprint. We have 200 locations across Canada and the United States. Offices, warehouses, cinemas, entertainment facilities, you name it. So I was most closely involved with dealing with our landlords when the pandemic hit. We, as a company, were 97% shut down. And, obviously the first thing we did was review all of our leases to see, what do they say? What happens if we're shut down? So some of our leases dealt with, so Cineplex really is an amalgamation of three entities. It started as a small company and acquired another company and acquired another company and acquired another company. So there's a whole bunch of companies that have kind of joined to form modern day Cineplex. So our contracts all hail from different backgrounds, Tim. And what we were involved with literally the day, I think it was March 11th, 2020, when COVID was named a pandemic by the World Health Organization. We immediately started reviewing our leases to see what did they say, because with no money coming in the door, it's very hard to pay your rent every month. I will say that I found on the negotiation piece, I found the Canadian landlords were great to deal with. I found a different mindset with US landlords. It was a different mindset. And I think there's a different mindset in the marketplace. The US is a much bigger marketplace. Landlords have many more options. I think Cineplex is also not as well known an entity in the United States as it is in Canada. So we have very close relationships with our landlords here, but our landlords were wonderful and treated us, as much as some of them were rationalizing their real estate portfolio at that time. They saw us as partners and they were wonderful. On the real practical legal side, though, the direction I've given our team is that on a go-forward basis, in all of our lease renewals, our lease amendments, our new leases, we have to deal with force majeure, particularly COVID-19. Okay, what about COVID-20? What about COVID-21? You know, what's next? The world is super connected. And for me, Tim, I would say it's not so much about, hey, we don't want to pay rent, or we don't want to do this, or we don't want to do that. It's about certainty. Because what we found with our leases, the leases that were, and the other contracts with our studios, with our suppliers, with our, you know, when the contract was silent, you're trying to say, we don't know what the story is. And I'm telling the exec, we'll figure it out and we'll report back to you. So what I've said to our guys is, let's try to get some certainty so that we know on a go forward basis, the next time we have to try to trigger force majeure, what's the certainty we're getting? Are we getting an abatement? Are we getting a reduction? Are we getting a grace period? What are we getting? And it's the certainty that I'm really interested in, because it helps us assess our cash flow and our financial situation.
Great, thank you. We do have limited time, so I have a few questions that are specific, I guess, to each of you. I know when in our preparation, Nizam, you mentioned how, and this was a theme actually of our GC forum last year, but how ESG fits in with risk management with you. So if you can speak a bit about that, how that those two concepts, kind of the interplay between the two and how it fits in with your world.
Sure. So as I mentioned with our environmental group, we work closely with them on disclosures that they do, such as, you know, I mentioned the Dow Jones Sustainability Index or the CDP disclosure. So we have a pretty close working relationship there as well. There are, you know, climate initiatives that we've undertaken at CP. So, for example, we're you know, we've worked on a hydrogen locomotive, which is something that our group would assist with in terms of that, you know, that on the legal side. But basically, you know, you have a close sort of working relationship with the team that deals with that specific area, the environmental area, the social and the governance area. We just kind of speaking more broadly, so our board of directors has a committee called Risk and Sustainability that deals with such matters. We also have a corporate governance committee, which most organizations will have. That committee also deals with social responsibility, so it's a little bit broader as well. So you see, I guess maybe to put it more broadly, you see the ESG area sort of permeating various parts of the business, you know, through the board level and into the business itself.
Great, thank you. And one of the things that I know some of you have touched on already is governance. And I know it's always a big issue in financial services. So Bindu, can you talk a bit about that? And you've been at different financial services company, how sort of governance works and sort of working with management and how you secure commitment from them and how your governance kind of fits in with that.
Yeah, it is a fascinating topic, right? Because I think good governance and the principles that, you know, maybe outwardly required or externally required of us at a board level, how that kind of governance permeates the organization and how you get better governance at the top of house when you've got, you know, better governance inside the house. And so, so for me, it's just been a real, you know, real opportunity to kind of learn about those principles. I think as lawyers, we often get what we understand, or we think we understand what good governance should look like, but then you see it playing out and it is much more fraught and much more interesting and much more nuanced than you would expect. You know, I would say, I think if I think about board governance and maybe where it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it was very much the board, you know, making decisions about itself and not necessarily having a lot of stakeholders to have to consult and to have to hear from. And I think, and I'm sure Nizam could speak to this. I mean, as well as Thomas, just the number of voices, the number of people who have something to say about how we're organizing ourselves, the number of people who are rating us about what we're doing, especially if you're a public company. It's a lot. I mean, but I would say it's also a great opportunity to hear from different perspectives. I mean, I think to me that when it comes back to it, it's kind of the diversity of perspectives and the benefits that arise from that. Don't get me wrong, there's moments where you're like, okay, enough opinions, thanks so much, we got this. But I think we all have a lot to learn from seeing things through different eyes, whether it's a shareholder, whether it's a community stakeholder, whether it's employees, and I think they're important stakeholders on our governance journey, as well as like some of the third parties and the ratings agencies who have a view and will make recommendations. So, I think governance, it may have been a sleepier place and a sleepier time, but I think, the range of stakeholders that we have coming to the table to weigh in on these topics, kind of the fact that it is like, from an ESG perspective, this is the G of ESG, right? And it's been there for a long time, but it's getting renewed and refreshed attention. And then I think, frankly, the complement of leaders that we have in our organization, both at board level and sort of deeper in the organization at executive tables and otherwise, we're bringing different perspectives. We're bringing different experiences to the table to talk about what, and really like from the truest sense of diversity, bringing those perspectives to talk about how things should work and how we want them to work. And so, it is not a sleepy area. It's a forever changing area. And, you're always sort of trying to rise to the next new challenge that's there and recalibrate your approach. Because governance is really supposed to make things work, right? It's supposed to make it operate. And so, it is adapting our processes to have regular and meaningful opportunities to engage with third parties who may want to provide us with input. And then how do we incorporate that? But before we incorporate it, how do we decide that that's the right thing for us to do as an organization and have the courage to have those conversations and not just react to what's happening? So it's a really neat place to be, and again, another one of the many things that we get to do through this great profession of law that I would not have imagined would be so interesting when I was a student back in the day. But I do really, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to get to operate in this space and get to contribute to it.
Great, thank you. And you've all been in private practice, and Roland is now, and a lot of the audience is at law firms. So how does risk management fit into the work you do with external law firms, and what have you seen, I guess, that has been great that they've done or very helpful or proactive, and where are the challenged areas? So Thomas, maybe I'll start with you on that question.
Yeah, I think a few things. I think the most important thing I think that our council could do, at the beginning, I kind of said that Cineplex is more than cinemas. We're in many different types of business, loyalty, gaming, entertainment facilities. I think one of the biggest things that our external counsel have done is they learn our business, and they learn, what are our pressure points? What do we care about? And what's actually really helpful is once they get to know our business and work with us a little while, they can say, hey, you're doing this over here, but will that affect these other things that you've got going on? So I think learning our business is really important. Just on that point, though, two other things. I really value it when our external counsel tell me what they think. So don't say, hey, you've got two choices, pick one. Tell me what you think. I'm going to make the decision, so that's on me. But for the hundreds of dollars an hour that we're paying, I think our external counsel should tell us exactly what they think we should do and why they should do it. That's why I'm going to external counsel. Either I like time to deal with it, or I like the expertise to deal with it, but tell me what you think. I think the last thing to this point about adding value, I called one of our external counsel from one of the big firms in Toronto a few days ago, needed a lawyer for a certain matter. He made a recommendation at his firm, and he said, but if after you speak with this lawyer, you don't feel there's a connection, here's 3 other excellent lawyers at 3 other firms that you should call. And that elevates that lawyer from just being a service provider and a biller to being a trusted partner and basically an extension of my legal department. I trust him. And I did go with his lawyer, but I appreciated that he was looking out. He said, I want to do what's best for Cineplex. So if my guy is not the best person for Cineplex, here's some excellent alternatives at other law firms. And that was really good. That was very helpful.
Great. Nizam, I don't know if you want to speak to sort of working with external law firms, what you found helpful and how your risk management strategy fits into how you work with them.
Sure. So I think there's a lot that external counsel have to offer, because everyone in the group here is dealing with risks, especially with inside companies. Sometimes just even having somebody send you something as simple as an article that says, hey, have you thought of this, or a publication piece or whatever, I think can be very helpful and focus you into an issue. So, even if it happens to be that firm's, newsletter on a certain area that they're sending out, I think that makes it very useful. So for example, I deal in the security space quite a bit. And so knowing sort of what's coming next from, whether it's a Securities and Exchange Commission or the regulators in Canada, certainly knowing that and having access to that before you're asked by your management or your board, so you're equipped to deal with these things, I think is important. So I often see counsel coming with sort of, I'll call it, it's the most simple thing, right? It's just sort of proactive thoughts, advice, and that I think goes a long way in terms of helping manage risk.
Great. And we're close to our time, but I want to give Bindu a chance to answer this question too, because I'm sure working in a positive way with your law firms is an important priority for you at the bank.
Absolutely. There's a question in the chat that sort of, how can law firms really help, understand the risks? And I think for me, the law firms and the lawyers that I love working with provide me advice that goes beyond the law itself, right? So they're weighing in with their opinion. If it's something super, super technical, I still want to understand, where do you land on that? And yes, I can read the statute too. And yes, I can read the case law. And yes, I'm very good at catastrophizing and coming up with the worst case scenario. But at the end of the day, none of my business partners, none of my colleagues want to hear about the worst possible scenario. They want to know somebody's thought about it, but they don't really want to hear about it. And that's a little bit about, I think, the relationship, the external counsel that I choose to go to, that I call on, that I want, they're going to help me not live in the place to advise my colleagues about how do we avoid the worst case scenario, but rather what's the more likely scenario and how are we going to tackle this and what's the likelihood of it coming. And so I would say, and maybe that comes from judgment, but the lawyers and maybe most of the people I talk to are a little further along in their career, but the external counsel that I go back to over and over and over again are the ones who, make it clear enough to me that they know what the worst case scenario is, but help me live in the place of where the likelihood is and kind of the more realistic and pragmatic approach to doing it. And then help me communicate that in a way back to my colleagues so that I'm not then having to do hundreds of hours of work over and on top of what they've done. I do think as internal counsel, we could do a better job with being that transparent with external counsel about what we want and giving them feedback when they hand over the 30-page memo that is really pretty much going to go into the archive in my email inbox. I was going to say in a desk drawer, but who's got desks anymore? And we can't print anything off anyway. So, but what's that document? What's that thing that's going to actually have me coming back again and again as a reference material, as a resource? So I think as internal counsel, as GCs, we owe it to those law firms to give them that advice. But I would also say to the law firms, you owe it to yourselves to ask for it, and then to take it when it's given to you. Because the number of times that you try to give somebody feedback and they're not interested in it, or they don't want to hear it, or they don't want to process it, you stop trying after a while. So So I think the law firms that understand the myriad of risks that we're managing, that it's not just legal risk, we're also thinking about reputation. We're thinking about the personal risk of giving like a really shitty answer to one of our colleagues. I'm not saying that doesn't mean we won't do it, but you can certainly help me make that a better message, right? That'll make me want to come back to you. I think thinking about the complexity of the risks that we deal with is a really good thing to keep in mind as we go. We know you're smart. That's why we called you. Now, what's going to make me call you again is not going to be that you are the smartest person, but rather you're the person who helps me through my problem.
Great. Well, that's a really good way to wrap up the discussion. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Valerie, who's going to close the panel. But thank you so much to everyone for a great discussion. Lots of really interesting insights, and I looked at the questions. There were I don't have any more, but if there's another question that we have time for, I'm happy to ask it. Valerie.
Yes, well, that was a very interesting conversation. Thank you all. Bindu, Nizam, Thomas, and Roland, thank you so much. And Tim and Kimedia, thank you as well. For the LMA folks on the line, I just want to remind you that we will have one more event before the end of the year, which is the evolution of first-party data for legal marketers, which will be hosted on December 6th. And I will take the opportunity to wish you all my best wishes for the holiday season. Thank you, everyone, for attending today, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. All right. Okay.